Today we're reading Chapter 3 from the Pagemaster. If you remember, last we left our characters, Richard Tyler, fantasy, horror, and adventure, had just narrowly escaped a haunted house in the horror chapter. They met characters such as Mr. Hyde and Dr. Jekyll, as well as the Frankenstein monster, and a few ghouls too. Now they're in a brand new land, which Adventure has said is the land of adventure. So let's see what happens next. Adventure. Sunlight illuminated the face of the cliffs, which seemed to be made entirely of books. Adventure led the way down a narrow, book-lined path toward the rocky shore below. Horror followed, shouting, "Hey, wait for me!" Richard lagged behind. His descent was slow and careful. Clinging to the cliffside of the path, he carefully tested every step. Fantasy fluttered alongside him, offering words of advice and encouragement. Adventure had already reached the shore. He made his way to a huge rock jutting out over the water. "Ah, home sweet home," he shouted. "Ain't it grand?" In his excitement, Horror tried to give Adventure a big hug. "Get your hands off me!" Adventure twisted out of Horror's embrace. "Sorry," Horror uttered sadly, his lower lip quivering. Adventure turned back to the water and continued to admire the scene. Taking a deep breath, he slashed his sword triumphantly through the salty air. "Ain't nothing like the sea to let a man know he's alive." Suddenly, a huge wave lifted up before him and splashed down over his head. Horror started to laugh. Spinning around, Adventure aimed his sword right at Horror's heart. "What are you laughing at, hunchbook?" He sputtered from under his wet mustache. A starfish, swept up by the waves, had attached itself to Adventure's nose. Adventure rolled his eyeballs around, trying to see what was stuck to his face. Horror laughed so hard that he slipped on the wet rock. Scrambling wildly to stay upright, he grabbed Adventure's peg leg. They both slid off the side of the rock. Richard and Fantasy were watching from the shore. "They fell in!" Richard exclaimed. Fantasy flew up over the rock. Richard followed. From the top of the rock, they looked down toward the water, expecting the worst. Fortunately, Horror and Adventure had fallen into a small boat. Horror had landed on top of Adventure. "Hi, guys!" Horror was grinning happily. "Will you just get off me?" Adventure wrestled out from under Horror. Suddenly he realized he was in a boat. He couldn't believe his luck. "A boat!" he shouted. "Come on, you landlubbers, climb aboard!" Fantasy helped Richard into the old boat. Richard immediately asked, "Is it safe?" "I've set to sea and worse," Adventure answered. "Ain't a craft afloat ever got the best of me." He stamped his peg leg to prove his point. It went through the bottom of the boat. He jerked his peg leg out of the hole. A geyser of water shot up into Fantasy's bloomers. "Woo, that's cold!" she shrieked. Water started to fill the boat. Horror panicked. "We're sinking! We're going down! Somebody do something!" Richard reacted quickly to the emergency. He pulled out his handkerchief and stuffed it into the hole. The water stopped gushing. "Thank you," Horror smiled sweetly to Richard. "You and you!" Adventure pointed his sword at Richard and Horror. "Man the oars!" Already he was taking command. "And me?" Fantasy asked. You can just sit there quietly, missy. We're on the land of adventure now." He jabbed his sword out toward the open sea. "Shove off, lads!" The boat jumped the breakers as it plied its way toward the vast horizon. Richard was apprehensive. "The water looks pretty choppy. Maybe we should have stayed where it was safe." Adventure turned to the frightened boy. "Lad, a ship in port may be safe." He smoothed out his mustache with his hook. "But that's not what ships were made for." boat glided through a mysterious curtain of fog into the open sea. Puffs of purplish gray clouds dotted the blue sky like smoke signals warning of danger. In long, regular waves, the ocean began to swell and roll. Ships ahoy! Adventure was the first to spot 4 small boats plowing over the swells, off the starboard side. They were in perfect formation, a half-dozen men in each. Whalin' men! Adventure shouted in admiration. Poised over the bow of the lead ship, a bearded, sinewy old man searched the water with wild eyes. He was wearing a ragged captain's coat and had a peg leg like Adventure's in place of one of his legs. Look! Another guy with a peg leg! Richard was amazed. Seems to be a fashion statement around here. Fantasy glanced sideways at Adventure. It's Captain Ahab, it is! Adventure grinned widely. Straight outta Moby Dick! Have you read it, boy? It's a whale of a book. Now, the whalers were only a few yards away. Ahab shouted toward Richard. Do you see him? See who? Richard shouted back. Ahab didn't reply. His attention was on the water ahead. There she blows! Ahab thrust his knotted finger out toward the horizon. All heads swiveled. Something very big was surfacing. The water parted and an enormous white whale exploded up through the surface. What's that? Richard asked as he turned to Adventure. The devil of the deep, the white whale, Moby Dick. From the whale's blowhole, a spray of water shot 100 feet into the air. Rivers of water cascaded down the giant whale's mountainous flank. Its small dark eyes blinked and focused on the whalers in their boats. I grin at thee, thou grinning whale! Ahab laughed maniacally, ordering his fleet to head straight for the white whale. The whale had the same idea. He headed straight for Ahab on a deadly collision course. He's insane! Fantasy pointed at Ahab. He's possessed! Horror screamed. He's my kind of guy! Adventure saluted. Moby Dick thrust up out of the water, somehow lifting his whole body completely above the ocean's surface. It looks like he's catching air, Richard thought. He's breaching! A voice shouted. Ahab readied his harpoon. Thou damned whale, thus I give up the spear! Ahab hurled his deadly iron weapon into the solid white buttress of the whale's head. Moby Dick smashed into the boats, ripping apart every last one. Men and timbers shot into the air. Ahab shouted no more. Wreckage littered the water's surface as the white whale swam off. Richard and the books watched in terror as the whale began a sweeping arc. The monster of the deep was returning, approaching at incredible speed. He's coming for us now! Richard screamed. Roll! Roll for your lives! Adventure drew his sword and leapt atop the bow of the boat. Richard and Horror grabbed the oars and began pumping as fast as they could. The whale caught the boat in its mouth, crushing it as it shot up toward the heavens. Abandon ship! Adventure shouted, but his order came too late. His friends were already tumbling into the thrashing water below. Richard sank down into the water like a stone, passing pieces of wood and debris from the wreckage. His eyes were still wide open, but he was trying to hold his breath. Unexpectedly, something bumped him from below. It was a barrel rising to the surface. He grabbed hold and floated up toward the light. The barrel shot up through the surface of the water. Scattered debris was bobbing in the water everywhere. There was nothing else, just Richard and the floating debris. Moby Dick had destroyed everything. Richard looked around for the books. Hey, guys! Where are you? How could they just leave him like that? They were his friends, the only friends he'd ever had. Then, not far from the barrel, something stirred the surface of the water. Richard panicked. He thought Moby Dick must be returning. Frantically, he dog-paddled over to a raft-like plank and climbed aboard. But it was Adventure who surfaced, waterlogged and barely alive. Adventure! Richard pulled the listless book up onto the plank. Using his first aid training, Richard pumped Adventure's pages like a bellows. Water squirted out of the pirate book's mouth like a fountain. The old seaman coughed and sputtered and slowly came around. Richard hugged him. Boy, am I ever glad to see you. Adventure twisted out of the hug. All right, enough with the hugging. Where's horror and fantasy? Richard asked. Adventure looked away. I searched for 'em much as I could, mate. Afraid they've gone below with David Jones. Adventure sadly removed his bandana. You mean they're... Reality began to sink in. Richard slumped down onto the plank and began to cry. She's a cruel sea, my lad. Adventure offered his bandana to Richard. But Richard refused to believe they were really dead. He got to his feet, cupped his hands around his mouth, and began to shout as loudly as he could. Horror! Fantasy! Turning around to call in a different direction, he spotted a group of dorsal fins racing towards their plank. Sharks! Adventure slashed his sword at the circling shark fins. We may be seeing them other two sooner than you think. Then, from out of a mysterious veil of fog, a skiff appeared. Look! Richard began to wave his hands frantically over his head. Help! Over here! Adventure squinted his good eye to get a better look. Careful, mate. Not all sharks are in the water. Two mangy sailors grinned as they maneuvered their skiff alongside the plank. They didn't look as if they had 5 teeth between them. Gum disease, Richard thought. The taller sailor was dressed like a pirate, with dirty-looking clothes and a hefty flintlock pistol stuffed into his thick belt. He pulled them on board. We're missing 2 others. Did you see him? Richard asked. You're all we catch today. You're all the catch we had today, the tall sailor said. The short sailor laughed and blew a ship's whistle. Another ship's whistle answered from inside the mysterious fog. Richard looked up in awe. A huge Spanish galleon, in full sail, crashed through the veil of fog, almost burying the small skiff. The name, Hispaniola, was painted on its flank. I knew it! It's him! Adventure pointed up toward the top of the ship. Flying high over the main mast was the infamous pirate flag, the Jolly Roger. It's who? Richard was already worried enough. The meanest, most black-hearted pirate who ever sailed the 7 seas. Adventure slowly reached for his sword, but the tall sailor had already drawn out his flintlock, brandishing it. He ordered, Just sit your keel down, mate. John Silver's expecting live company. Richard was the first to come flying over the starboard rail of the Hispaniola. He hit the deck and tumbled to a stop in the middle of a bunch of filthy cutthroat pirates. Things were definitely not looking good. A fat pirate named George Merry lifted Richard to his feet, waving a rusty knife in front of his face. Richard backed away from the knife into the arms of a rotten-toothed Tom Morgan. Tom raised his cutlet under Richard's chin. Give the word, Captain, Silver, sir, and I'll show you the color of his insides. Red, red, my insides are red! Richard shouted, hoping to convince the pirate that there was no need to open him up. Stow your cutlass, Tom Morgan, came a deep voice from the stern. I want a better look at his outsides first. A hulking, one-legged figure hobbled up in front of Richard. He was leaning against a crutch fashioned out of an old tree branch. Perched on his shoulder was a parrot, as mangy and mean as any of the pirates. Silver squinted down at Richard. Are you Long John Silver? Richard asked in amazement. Aye, lad, the very same. Right out of Treasure Island. Silver hobbled around Richard, squeezing the boy's tender shoulders with his huge calloused hand. He's the runt of the litter, all right, but he'll do. Do for what? Asked Richard.
Well, seeing as how me men plucked you out of the water like a drowning bilge rat, you'll be joining our happy family as our new cabin boy.
Silver gestured around the circle of dirty pirates. Richard faked a smile. Thanks, but I already have a family, and I'm sure they're wondering where I am. I think I'll just be getting home now. The gang of pirates pointed their weapons at Richard.
Men think ye are home,
Silver grinned. Suddenly there was a shout from the ship's rail.
John Silver, what do you think you're doing?
There was Adventure, standing atop the deck rail. Adventure pointed a threatening finger at Silver.
Touch one hair on that boy's head, and I'll chop your liver so fine it won't be fit for a party cracker.
Silver grinned.
Come aboard, matey.
A pirate pushed Adventure down onto the deck in front of Silver.
Well now, don't you be looking familiar like?
Silver spat and leaned in close to Adventure.
You wouldn't happen to be going after me treasure now, would you?
Adventure climbed to his feet and ruffled his pages.
You ain't got any treasure worth going after.
The other pirates, already distrustful of Silver, began to mutter uneasily amongst themselves. Silver reacted to the mutinous grumble at once.
He's lying,
Silver shouted.
There's plenty of treasure for all ye.
Silver jabbed his crutch at Adventure.
Search him,
he ordered.
The boy, too.
Tom Morgan lifted Adventure and began to shake him upside down by his peg. An arsenal of late 18th century maritime weaponry poured out from between his pages. Flintlocks, knives, sabers, axes, and cannonballs fell to the deck. On the other side of Silver, George Mary was searching Richard. From one pocket, he pulled out the nail and the $5 bill his father had given him. From another, the library card.
Why, looky here, Captain.
He handed the goods over to Silver. Silver held up the $5 bill.
Now, what might this be?
It's money! You can keep it! Richard said, hoping Silver could be bought off. The pirates looked at each other and burst out laughing. Silver tossed the bill overboard. Then he started picking his teeth with the nail as he turned his attention to the library card. That's my library card, Richard protested. He didn't want to lose his passport out of this crazy place.
A cabin boy don't need no library card.
Silver tossed it overboard. Richard and Adventure ran to the rail, watching the card flutter down toward the water. All hope of escape was vanishing with it. In the sky behind Richard, clouds began to swirl and form themselves into a strange shape. It was the Pagemaster. With a mighty blast of his wind, this cloud-like Pagemaster suddenly blew the library card across the surface of the ocean toward land ho! A pirate in the crow's nest shouted. Silver and his men rushed to the rail. Clearly visible on the horizon was an island distinguished by a rocky cliff shaped like a skull.
There she be, mateys.
Silver jabbed his crutch out toward the skull.
Skeleton Island.
The parrot ruffled its wings.
Pieces of meat! Ah! Pieces of meat!
Skeleton Island. Excited by the thought of buried treasure, the pirates hurried up the sandy shore after breaching their skiffs. Silver hobbled along on his crutch. He cursed like a madman whenever flies settled on his sweaty flesh. Tugging at the rope, holding Richard and Adventure captive, he would occasionally fix them with a deadly stare. Adventure spoke under his breath to Richard.
Stay on your toes, mate. Soon as Silver goes for gold, we'll make our break.
A group of pirates stopped dead in their tracks next to the remains of a human skeleton. The bony, dry skeleton lay perfectly straight. Its feet pointed in one direction. Its arms and hands raised above its head were pointing in the direct opposite direction.
What sort of way is that for bone to lie? Asked one of the pirates. 'Tain't natural.
Richard couldn't help noticing that as mean and ruthless as pirates were, they also seemed to be a superstitious lot, deathly afraid of spirits.
This island's haunted, said a second pirate. It's accursed, it is.
Silver examined the skeleton.
Ye yellow sea dogs! The bones is the compass pointing the way to the doubloons.
The pirates broke into a run toward the treasure, but then they stopped abruptly. Something was wrong. Silver hobbled up. Before him was a deep pit. At the bottom rested an open, clearly empty treasure chest. "It's gone! The treasure's gone!" George Merry jumped into the pit, dropping to his knees. He raked the sand with his fingers, but came up with only a single gold piece. 1 gold piece! He lifted the coin defiantly before Silver. "This your treasure, is it?" Adventure turned to Richard. "Stand by for trouble." "We might have known you'd double-cross us." Merry turned to the other men, who started to grumble in agreement. Silver reached for his flintlock, but the other pirates beat him to it. A dozen guns, swords, and knives were pointed directly at him. "Throw down your weapon, John Silver," Merry ordered. "You'll be regretting this, George Merry." Silver reluctantly tossed down his flintlock. "Save your speeches." Merry gestured for the pirates to take aim. "Dead men don't bite." Richard shut his eyes tight and swallowed hard. Adventure did the same. "Ooh!" A horrible, ghostly howl descended from the trees. The pirates' heads swerved upward. Their faces shared the same terrified look. "What was that?" The ghostly voice then continued loudly. 15 men on the dead man's chest." Yo ho ho and a bottle of rum. "Evil spirits!" Tom Morgan cried. Another voice, higher pitched but just as spooky, joined the first. "Oh, your mama drinks bilge water." The pirates moved their flintlocks around, trying to track the voices. "Over here," the first voice wailed. "No, over here, stupid," the higher voice returned. The pirates frantically glanced from tree to tree. There was a rustle of leaves, then something swung down over the pirates' heads. Bang, 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 bang! Pistol balls flew in every direction. "Sanctuary! Sanctuary!" Richard felt a surge of joy at the familiar voice. "Horror, you're still alive!" "Not for long!" George Merry was aiming his flintlock directly at Horror. Wee! Something swung down past Mary's face, leaving a trail of pixie dust in its wake. "Fantasy!" Richard shouted. Merry tried to hold back a sneeze. Achoo! His flintlock went off, blasting a cluster of coconuts off a tree. They fell on Tom Morgan's head, knocking him out cold. George Merry was spitting mad. "Get them!" he shouted. In the scramble that followed, Silver's crutch was knocked out from under him. He cursed and grunted as he dragged himself over the sand to retrieve it. Adventure was grinning. Finally, there was going to be a good fight. He lifted his sword and slashed at the rope that bound him to Richard. The snap of the rope sent him reeling. He fell backwards over the edge of the pit and into the treasure chest. Horror, who was escaping from a pirate, jumped on top of the chest, accidentally slamming it shut. "Let me out of here! Let me out of here!" Adventure cried, but his muffled shout went unanswered. The fight continued. 2 pirates attacked Fantasy, swiping at her with their cutlasses. Swiftly, she flew above them and tied their pigtails together. They chased after her, but their pigtails soon snagged on a tree, causing them to whip around and smash into each other. Down they went. Nearby, Horror was circling round and round another pirate, getting him so dizzy that he was soon seeing double. 2 horrors, then quadruple horrors, then hundreds of horrors were surrounding him. Horror made his most monstrous face, shouting, "Booga, booga, booga!" The pirate screamed in terror and ran off. Silver was climbing to his feet when the terrified pirate ran past, bumping against him. Silver stumbled forward, only to find himself face to face with Richard. Now it was pirate against boy. On the ground, midway between them, lay a cutlass. They both saw it at the same time. Richard stared straight into Long John Silver's squinting, watery eyes. The pirate was more than twice the boy's size. Normally, Richard would have run, but for once his heart, beating fast and sure, was telling him to stand his ground. Fantasy fluttered up behind Richard. "The sword, honey!" she whispered. "Go for the sword!" Silver's gaze shifted from Richard to the cutlass, then back to Richard. "Don't even think of it, boy. You ain't got the heart." Silver made the first move, but Richard was quicker. "Stay back!" the boy ordered as he lifted the heavy cutlass in his small hands and aimed it directly toward Silver's big gut. Silver squinted, his eyes darting back and forth between Richard and the razor-sharp cutlass. "A vast job. Lad, somebody could get hurt with that blade you got there." "I know," Richard had to agree. 23% of all injuries are caused by knives or other sharp objects. What? This statement caught Silver off guard for a second. You're right you are, boy." Silver glanced over Richard's shoulder at a beach skiff. Pointing toward the small boat, he pleaded, "You're not gonna make me get on that there ship and row away now, are you?" Richard glanced at the skiff. "That's exactly what I'm gonna do," he answered, wishing he thought of the idea himself. Richard moved backward to let Silver pass. Carefully, without taking his eyes off the cutlass, Silver hobbled down to the skiff. "Easy now, mate, easy. I'm going peacefully. Right ye are, into the boat. Aye, aye." Silver climbed into the boat and used his crutch to push off. "You be a hard lad, Richard Tyler," Silver shouted. "Good sailing to ye." His huge hands grabbed the oars. With a few sure strokes, the skiff was heading out to the open sea. Richard glanced down at the cutlass. Suddenly his hands began to shake. The weapon fell to the sand. So did Richard. Fantasy and Horror rushed up, congratulating him on his bravery. Richard was in shock. He couldn't believe what he had just done. "Boy, I wish my dad could have seen me. By the way, what happened to Adventure?" A loud pounding noise came from inside the treasure chest. Horror scampered over. "Who's there?" he asked. "It's me, Adventure!" came the muffled answer. "Adventure who?" Horror liked riddles. "What do you mean, Adventure? Who opened the blasted top of this coffin, you dog-eared?" Horror raised the lid, and Adventure bounded out, swinging his sword ready for a fight. "Let me at him!" he cried. Then he looked around and discovered there was no one left to fight. "You've got perfect timing, Robin Hood," Fantasy teased. Adventure snarled and kicked at the sand. Gesturing toward Fantasy and Horror, Richard said, "I was just thanking these guys for saving us." "That was nothing," Adventure bragged. "I could have taken the lot of them with one hand tied behind my back." Waving his hook in the air, he stomped off toward the beach. Horror picked up the bandana lying on the sand and hobbled off after him. Adventure was still moving down the beach, kicking sand and grumbling to himself, when Horror caught up with him. "Ahoy, baby!" Horror had tied the bandana over his head. In his hand, he was swinging a piece of driftwood as if it were a pirate sword. "Aye, we're the adventurous men!" Adventure glared at Horror. "Go away! You don't know what you're talking about." I know I'm not your favorite kind of book, but I could be just like you," Horror smiled. "You'll never be Adventure. You ain't got the spine for it." Adventure pointed at Horror's bandana. "And take that stupid thing off." Horror's lower lip began to tremble as he pulled off the bandana. "Sorry." Adventure walked off grumbling, leaving Horror feeling alone and rejected. In a few minutes, Horror hobbled off down the beach in the opposite direction, not paying much attention to where he was going. Richard was sitting next to the water. He had written the word exit on the sand with a stick, but a small wave soon slid up and washed the word away. He sighed. "Why the long face? You were a real hero." Fantasy fluttered down in front of Richard. "I lost my library card. Now I can't check you out. I can't check anybody out. We'll never get to the exit now." Richard rested his head on his knees. Gently, Fantasy raised Richard's chin up with her wand. "Never say never around Fantasy, honey. Sometimes you've got to fight to make a wish come true." Farther down the beach, Adventure was still grumbling and kicking his way through the sand when a wet piece of paper stuck to his peg. He tried to shake it loose, but it wouldn't come off. Then he tried jumping up and down, but the paper still didn't budge. Finally, he sat on the sand and peeled it off. His eyes opened wide when he realized what he was holding. He hurried back to where Richard and Fantasy were sitting.
"Why are you sitting around like a bunch of old wenches at tea time?" he asked.
Extending both his hands and his hand and his hook toward Richard, he said,
"Pick one."
Richard considered his choices. That one. Richard picked Adventure's hand.
"You're a bright lad,"
Adventure said, opening his fist. "My library card!" Richard's face lighted up. "Where'd you find it?" Adventure thumped his chest.
"Why, I wrestled it away from 3 sharks who was eyeing it for breakfast."
And Rapunzel wears a wig, Fantasy said, rolling her eyes in disbelief. "Where's Horror?" Richard asked. "Wasn't he with you?" Adventure scratched his head with his hook.
"Well, he was, but I sorta. He kinda."
"Now, what did you say to him?" scolded Fantasy.
"Well, I'll go find him."
Adventure plodded off down the beach, calling,
"Horror!"
Adventure climbed to the top of a tall sand dune and gasped in amazement. On the other side of the dune, the walls and towers of a tiny storybook castle rose above the sandy beach. Outside the castle walls, scores of tiny 6-inch men were busy tying a lifeless-looking horror to the ground with a series of ropes. They looked like the little Lilliputians from Gulliver's Travels. Adventure drew his sword. Waving it over his head, he shouted,
"Hang on, mate, adventure's coming!"
When they heard his thunderous voice, the Lilliputians quickly gathered in military formations and shot little arrows at Adventure.
"To the Funak!"
they shouted. Adventure flipped open his heavy binding like a shield, deflecting the little arrows, but one of them sank into his peg leg. Adventure bent over and yanked it up.
"Say your prayers, you little 2-legged shrimps!"
Breaking the arrow over his knee, Adventure charged straight to the tiny men. The Lilliputian troops panicked, retreating in confusion into the brush.
"Come back, you cowardly lubbers!"
Adventure slashed his sword through the air triumphantly.
"Aha! Just see him run, mate!"
Horror didn't answer. Horror wasn't even moving. Quickly, Adventure cut the ropes with his sword, lifting Horror's lifeless head.
"You had a good heart, you did, and you was braver than you knew. I'd walk the plank if I thought it would bring you back."
"You would?" Horror suddenly spoke. Adventure's eyes opened wide as saucers. He thrust Horror out in front of him. Horror was smiling his best horrible smile. By this time, Fantasy and Richard had appeared on the scene. "Aren't they just too cute?" Fantasy commented. Adventure dropped Horror like a hot potato. Drawing his sword, he slashed it through the air in a manly fashion. Richard rushed up to Horror. "Are you okay?" "Thanks to my friend, here I am." Horror hugged Adventure.
"Never, never, never hug me again!"
Adventure yelled. Horror backed off. "Oh, okay." "Did you see that?" Fantasy was staring at her wand. "See what?" Richard looked at the wand. It blinked on for a millisecond. "My wand! It's blinking! That can only mean one thing!" Fantasy was ecstatic. "The exit?" Richard was still hopeful.
"The checkout desk."
Adventure was hopeful too. "A happy ending!" Horror started to jump up and down, clapping for joy. And that's the end of that chapter.